So we'll be recording the first half of the conversation while we're hearing from the speakers and so on, but not from the Q&A, which is a really important part of this. We're looking forward to hearing from lots of you in that. Great. Well, I think it's a couple of minutes past. I'm sure a few other people will trickle in, but let's get started. Really happy to introduce you, to welcome you to this webinar on behalf of the 4 organizations who you can see named in that opening slide: Climate Catalyst, Landscape Finance Lab, Flow Country, and WaterLANDS. As I said, please do introduce yourself and say a bit about where you are based, what landscape you're in. That'd be lovely just to connect us all a little bit. And then maybe I could just move straight into the next slide. So welcome, obviously, to this Peatlands 101, a conversation focusing on Europe and on the importance of peatland for investors and the different ways in which investors can become involved in this, and the vital role that investors have got in the protection and the restoration of peatland. I'm Stephen. I'm the Chief Executive of Climate Catalyst, the organization's name behind putting this together. We're a fairly new organization. We work behind the scenes, bringing different actors together, both in civil society, in business, in the investment world, to accelerate policy change. And we're focused on 2 issues, one in Europe and one in Asia. And of course, the topic we've chosen for our first initiative in Europe is peatland protection. And we're working really closely with lots of organizations, including Landscape Finance Lab. We've got 3 great speakers today, which is going to be terrific, and they're going to be really quite concise. So we'll have plenty of time for Q&A. So please do, as we go along, please do post into the chat questions that you've got and highlight if that's for a particular speaker. And we can obviously keep track of that and then bring those questions back in. And at the close, there's a really important addition that we're going to have there before we move into the call to action, which is an important part of this conversation, which is that there will be a couple of polls where we want to get feedback from you, both on this event, but also importantly on what would be practically most useful for you as a next step, so that we can make sure that we, as I said, we really make the most of this and make sure that what will help you to engage and work on this issue is something that we can follow up and we get that feedback. So that would be great to do. Just one more slide from me and then I'll pass to our first speaker. So yeah, just a bit of housekeeping. You're getting live examples of the importance of the first one, which is if you are in listening mode, then please do all mute your microphone so we don't get that disruption if you get an urgent call. Please put the questions that we've got, that you have, as I said, mentioned just now, into the chat box. Be assured that the slides that you're going to see now are something that we will be sharing with you all afterwards. So don't worry if you can't capture everything that's in there in your notes or whatever, because we will circulate those after the call, as well as some indication of what the next steps will be. So if we can keep moving, as I said, we've got 3 speakers, and the first of those speakers is Dr. Shane McGuinness from University College Dublin and from WaterLANDS, and he's going to kick us off. So I'm going to pass to you first, Shane, and we can move through to the first of your slides, please.
Great. Thank you very much.
Over to you, Shane.
Excellent. Thank you very much for the introduction, Stephen. I'm very, very glad to speak today. I'm conscious of how long it would ordinarily take to communicate this particular message, and I apologize in advance for some of the other experts on this call who might be appalled at trying to cover this in 5 minutes and not 5 hours, but I'll do my best. So let's move on and very briefly talk about what peatlands are. Well, peat is basically an ancient energy store, and it's been building up over millennia through basically delayed decomposition. So things that haven't broken down, mainly because of a lack of oxygen, because it's so wet. It doesn't break down very fast, or indeed at all in some cases. Now, this is slow, but it's consistent accumulation in very wet environments. And the analogy I often give to students when I'm talking about this is think of the sink and the bath in your bathroom. In the sink, you turn the tap on and it fills up very quickly. That's like a rainforest. It builds up that carbon very quickly, but it doesn't store very much. Versus the bath beside that with a leaky tap into it. It doesn't fill up very fast, but it fills up to a much, much greater extent. That's what peatlands are. They store a huge amount, but it's largely unseen carbon stored and indeed accumulated. If you just look at the list on the right as I scan through this, you can see some of the, I suppose, the jurisdiction, some countries, some islands that are some of the highest proportions in terms of land mass of where that carbon is. Lots of islands around the world, oceanic islands in particular, and you can see the representation of both Finland, Singapore, Estonia, and then Ireland a little bit further down with Sweden too. One of the important figures on this slide here is the storage of this carbon, and this relates to the unseen nature of this, and that there's a huge amount of carbon stored here, but it's largely underground or underwater or both. So up until quite recently, peatlands, wetlands in general, weren't particularly seen as very important either for carbon or for anything else really. They were drained, they caused disease, they caused all kinds of other problems. Now they're seen as a solution to all kinds of magical, wonderful things. If you think about where they are, though, it's really only 3% of the land of this planet that they cover, but they hold 30% of the carbon. They indeed hold twice the carbon of all the forests of the planet put together. And you can see on the red screen there that it's still very, very little in terms of where they are. Let's focus on Ireland for a moment as well, and as a case study to see exactly how important they are for Ireland and how this can be potentially valuable. They cover 20% of Ireland in terms of its surface. Varied degradation and visibility, like I said, a lot of it is underground, and indeed a lot of this is under grass or under trees or something else. In the past or in the recent past, 30% of this has been drained, forested, mined, or converted to something else, and only a fraction of what remains is protected. So, for example, 8% of our raised bogs, so really, really deep raised bogs in the middle of Ireland, are protected, and 23% of Ireland's peat soil is now under conifer plantations. So both invisible really, and also being expended quite quickly because of this conifer plantation. So it's almost like a direct conduit into the atmosphere. However, Ireland is still a haven for peatlands. So despite all of that, we still have a huge proportion, both nationally and in particular, a huge proportion of the remaining raised bog. So active raised bog, it's this really deep bog, and it also holds some very rare species across Europe and globally. In terms of the extent and use of this in Ireland, you can see, well, there's a lot of raised bog, but there's also a much larger proportion of blanket bog. So this kind of thinner blanket bog that covers mountainsides, especially in the west of Ireland, and you might think of a Scottish upland. Well, that would be largely blanket bog. But there's also a vast proportion, like I said earlier, under grasslands, this invisible stuff. And in terms of the proportion of Ireland within various land use categories, you can see just that proportion that's under forestry at the moment. Domestic cutover is what we term that small artisanal use that's been happening over 100 years or more. The slow nibbling of the edges. You can also see the amount that's under grassland too, but vast areas nonetheless. If we think about who owns this, now this is the tricky one, especially in Ireland in comparison to other jurisdictions, because it is extremely mixed. First of all, we have our semi-state peat extraction company, which owns about 80,000 hectares of this. Second in line, not in line necessarily, but is Cuilcha, our semi-state forestry company, over 230,000 hectares of peat soil alone, most of that under forestry. Our National Parks and Wildlife Service, conversely, only owns about 100,000 hectares of this. And then over 200,000 is in a mosaic of private ownership or commonage with very, very hazy use rights or non-use rights or ownership rights. And that's what the figure really shows here. The remainder then is this unseen peat. It's under agriculture, it's difficult to get it, it's very difficult to measure, and it's increasingly difficult to convince, I suppose, that set of landowners that a change in the way that has been managed for 100 years is likely on the cards and is potentially quite valuable. And just if we take a step back and think about how this is being, well, used or eroded or nibbled away, this is a community example of 130 hectares, and you can see the slow erosion around the edges through this artisanal or direct fuel really of local communities versus industrial extraction. So these moonscapes that have been created over the past, well, less than 100 years, frankly, but it has a massive impact on the environment. These would have been drained, and mined to a certain depth and then attempted to be restored back to some kind of wetter environment, but oftentimes not restored to something that is really functional. Okay, so that's the first part. That shows how important peatlands are and their extent and what peat is, frankly. What I might do is look at Ireland in particular now, and in particular from a financial perspective, and what we're trying to do with Peatland Finance Ireland, because I suppose that's the crux of this call right now. The lay of the land at the moment in Ireland, there's lots of different actors involved in this within Ireland. And there's all kinds of different funding streams that these feed into. So on the left, the organizations that are involved with this, and there's all kinds of small programs and big programs and linked programs across departments, which is great to see. All of this feeds into healthy habitats and communities and climate, which again is fantastic. However, thus far, it stops there at this brown dotted line, because there is no consideration thus far of any kind of return on this, whether it be to carbon, to biodiversity, to communities, or to water. Some of those, well, the four key sectors really that could come from this. The carbon markets are starting to emerge, which is fantastic. It's great news. Varying levels of development across Europe and across the world. There's all kinds of different political ecologies around this, which define how this would operate. But there's also much larger opportunities, or certainly as significant opportunities, in terms of the cost of compliance around these four sectors. In other words, offsetting what you would otherwise be spending to protect the biodiversity of your area, or as the case in Ireland, spending fines for not protecting this area. There's all kinds of other costs of compliance as well, in terms of water treatment in particular, or prevention of flooding, which we spend millions on every year. Whereas peatlands, to a degree, can offset the costs of that and the cost of compliance of directives. If we look at some of these ecosystem services, or nature-based solutions, another de rigueur term at the moment, for this, we can look at, first of all, carbon. Like I said earlier, they're a continual sequestration for thousands of years. In Ireland, it's up to 9,000 or 10,000 years since the last glacial maximum. The last time a glacier sat on top of this area, it has been, in some areas, building this carbon for thousands of years. And if we take a look at a fully functioning raised bog, that habitat I talked about earlier, that's so important, it sequesters around 50 grams per meter squared per year, which is about half a ton per hectare per year of carbon equivalent. And that's really important, as you can imagine. Now, it's presumptuous to think that we can completely restore all of this to perfect, fully functioning raised bog nationally. That's simply not going to happen, but we can always aspire towards that. There will always be edges to any of this. However, because of that condition of all of this, it's currently emitting 2.3 megatons of carbon annually across Ireland, which is a bit of an issue. Half of that comes from under peat grasslands, which is a very recent figure, which our agricultural sector has not always communicated, and I think that's going to be really important, and it's also an opportunity for our agricultural sector too. And a third of this is from that domestic extraction that I talked about earlier, this small artisanal nibbling away at the edges, which again is it's useful that it's now being accounted for. However, if restored, there's an opportunity here, in fact, a massive opportunity, because this could sequester 6 to 10 megatons of carbon annually. And that's not that static figure like I talked about, the sink versus the bath. This is the bath here. This will do it over thousands of years if the conditions are correct and if the long-term vision is there to support this. Not that we'll be around in 1,000 years. In terms of water, well, I talked about water quality, but also in terms of filtration services that peatlands provide, the sediment load that it would then remove from this, and the nutrients, either dissolved or suspended solids within there too, that it plays a role in removing. And at the moment, our, well, semi-state water company or other private entities that are removing these things from water spend millions every year doing that. So if we can combine with some of these sectors, there's a huge opportunity, a cost saving, and maybe even an offsetting associated with it too. Also, in terms of flood attenuation, like I said, it will not completely get rid of floods, but it will slow the flow of these, making any of those 10-year events or 100-year events much less impactful. It's keeping the water up where it originally would have stayed, or at least slowly flowed out of. Okay, and then in terms of soil stability, like I talked, there's wise use options as well in terms of carbon farming. So using these areas wisely, whether it be through polluticulture, so growing on wet areas, whether it be raising a lower intensity level of food, extracting some kind of renewable fuel from this, wood or other fibres, or indeed building materials or something else, or it could be rushes for roofs. There's also that softer stuff that is very, very hard to quantify, but is nevertheless potentially to be part of a bundled ecosystem service here in terms of culture, the amenity, and indeed the spirituality that a lot of these areas have provided. In terms of current spending on Ireland, 30 million euro a year, 96% of that is direct government spending, like I said, top down. However, restoring and rehabilitating all of this is estimated to cost well in excess of 1 billion euro. So we are far short. However, it's worth it. So as I said, 5 megatons at potentially 50 euro a ton, which is a good price, but prices are rising. That would yield 250 million euro a year continually if the conditions are correct. And that's on carbon credits alone. Our recent analysis through Peatland Finance Ireland has found that actually the majority of this area could be restored for a price significantly, well, under that anyway, and that 80% of emissions associated with this could be captured within this threshold too. So there's a massive opportunity, and it is cost effective if done correctly. Just as a very brief overview of Peatland Finance Ireland, this is our single slide that we tend to provide for this. What we're attempting to do is blend public investment, carbon credits, and commercial finance into a single pool, fund, or trust, from which we then support energy, forests, water, and agriculture to then generate carbon, water, biodiversity, and communities and livelihoods from this. Importantly, at a catchment and national level, that it's embedded in national policy, which is therefore embedded in EU policy, which has much greater legitimacy internationally and can attract the level of investors that we need to support this. And the timing is right. There are climate and biodiversity awareness emergencies. There's an advanced scientific understanding of this, and economic tools are emerging. Standards, common agricultural policies, policy obligations are there as well in terms of climate justice, and there's an increasing realization that this is important from both a public perspective and a corporate perspective in terms of transitional and reputational risks. The caveat here, my last point, is that peatland restoration requires significant upfront investment. It is not a cheap endeavor, but it has significant paybacks if done correctly. Okay, thanks very much.
Perfect.
Finish there.
Thank you, Shane. As you said, an impossible task. So thanks for packing all of that in. And yeah, just a reminder that those slides will come around. You've given us obviously an incredibly, clear articulation of why this is so important, both in terms of current emissions and in terms of the potential for peat to operate as a carbon sink, and also obviously the opportunity specifically in Ireland. So that's great. We're going to pass straight over to our next speaker. Rupal is Strategic Finance Advisor to Landscape Finance Lab. Prior to that, she worked for a decade in different senior roles at Citibank, and her particular focus is really getting to the absolute core of why we're gathered here today, which is looking at what the early stage opportunities are for finance and investment in peatland protection and restoration. So over to you, Rupal.
Thank you, Stephen, much appreciated. So if just building upon what Shane said, building a peatland finance industry, what does it actually look like? Where is the path forward? So the peatland finance industry is at a very nascent stage, but with the right building blocks, it really does have the potential to become mainstream. Given that we are at the early stages, it's important to demonstrate proof of concept through some smaller projects, and it's really essential that these projects are executed carefully and don't have a negative impact on the landscape. Best practices do need to be implemented at this incubation stage in order to ensure that when the industry is, in inverted commas, mainstream, standards that financiers will have to adhere to are high and are right for the landscape. So though we're in the pilot stage at the moment, we should really look to structure investments that will allow us to seamlessly move to the next phase of the life cycle, that being a marketplace. The philanthropic capital and concessional capital, Shane alluded to that with government grants, etc. That is really gold at the moment. There's not much of it around. So if we are able to secure it, we have to be very careful as to how we can use that to really crowd in commercial capital and use it effectively and almost structure transactions in the commercial, with a commercial framework to make sure that they are ready to be off-taken by the mainstream financiers. So there's a number of different financing instruments that we can use. However, during today's session, we'll focus predominantly on carbon credit financing and just outlining some of the potential investment opportunities that carbon credit financing could bring to the peatland industry. So what are carbon credits? And we can probably move over to the next slide. Thank you, Disha. So carbon credits are a tradable commodity that allows an emitter to compensate carbon emissions that are equivalent to 1 ton of carbon dioxide or any other type of greenhouse gas. Carbon credits can be obtained by monitoring and certifying the positive environmental impact of relevant solutions, such as rewetting peatlands, in terms of how much carbon dioxide they reduce. The tons of carbon dioxide emissions that have been saved through the use of an intervention can be sold on the global carbon markets, and the buyers, who often tend to be large manufacturing companies, will be permitted to emit an equivalent amount of that carbon dioxide. Carbon credits therefore provide a mechanism that allows enterprises to finance their work by capitalizing on their climate change mitigation impacts. So if we just delve into this diagram a little bit further, so carbon credit is a financing mechanism that's suitable for enterprises that already have a solid track record and a proven and convincing business model. So it can be used for startups as well, but it is a bit more difficult. The diagram on this slide is probably fairly self-explanatory. Investors invest money in the enterprise or the financing entity with the hope to either receive carbon credits in exchange for their initial investment as a repayment and or returns on their initial capital from the revenue that's generated by selling carbon credits later down the line. So though this mechanism may look fairly straightforward, there's quite a few steps that need to be taken between an entity actually receiving money from an investor and them actually being able to extract value from the carbon credits generated. So I'm going to focus on the box on the bottom left and saying, well, how does that carbon project development support actually work? And we can probably go through to the next slide, please. Thank you. So this slide has been provided by Climate Neutral Group, just for good order, and is being used to illustrate through today's session, the process at a very high level. I'm sure there's a number of carbon credit experts here who may or may not agree with this. Please note that this is purely an illustration. It is not applicable to every single project. And we're looking at this from a peatland perspective. So we start at the bottom and work our way upwards. At the bottom, we have the degraded peatland, which is our key asset. As described on the previous slide, the capital is invested by investors into a company or a project developer or a financing entity or any sort of vehicle that can hold the capital to regenerate, that will engage in activities to regenerate and conserve the peatlands. This is the intervention piece that's highlighted in orange. The entity then starts to collect some of the data on the impact of that their activities is having on sequestering carbon. Once there's enough confidence that there is an impact, they engage with a third party. So, for example, Climate Neutral Group, Forest Carbon, there's a number of entities out there who can help with this next stage. But engage with someone who's really experienced in carbon credit development to carry out a project design. The project design is then validated by an independent validation and verification body. And then following that, there's a registration process that's normally carried out with the likes of Gold Standard or Vera. The third party should provide relevant support to basically work with the verification and validation body, as well as the registration process with Gold Standard or Vera. The carbon credit market is rigorously regulated and monitored. Important to note that there are 2 different kinds of markets on which an entity can trade their carbon credits: a voluntary market, as well as the officially regulated certified emissions reduction market. The former is obviously less regulated than the latter. In order to certify as a carbon credit producing organization, an upfront investment is needed to build a portfolio and cover the costs of that certification, which can range in the middle 5-digit US dollar range. And it's quite hard to put a cost on it, which is why it's probably appropriate for those entities who are slightly advanced in their life cycle. Projects also have to submit themselves to at least an annual monitoring activity, if not more often, which also incurs expenses. So to conclude this, a balanced view needs to be taken into account when accounting for the cost of the project versus the potential value of the carbon credits generated. And I will pause there and pass back to Stephen.
Wonderful, thank you. 3 slides, but lots of content. And thanks for those of you who so far posted questions into the chat. I'm sure there are questions to Rupal too. Obviously, like what she's focusing on there really goes to the core of our conversation today. The third and final speaker, hopefully we can just bring the slides back up, is Patrick, who stepped in at quite short notice. Big thank you to him, because Kevin, who was the original speaker from Flow Country, is unable to make it today. Patrick works for Nature Scotland, and his focus is on scaling nature-based solutions in Scotland. So he's a perfect person to tell this story to us. And as I said, he's the third and final speaker, and then we'll go to the questions that are coming into the chat. So Patrick, 5 minutes from you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Stephen. Thank you everyone for being here. I'll do my best, and I apologize for my accent. So the Scotland Flow Country, so the area northeast of Scotland, a very large area, pristine almost in terms of relative terms when looking at the rest of the country, hosting some of the deepest peats around the world, sites of exceptional beauty and biodiversity interest, also very important for the local communities. So we're talking about 400,000 hectares of peatland, and interestingly, it represents twice the carbon, it sequesters twice the carbon value of all the woodlands in the UK. So interestingly, it's really something of great value that we should look to preserve. The problem, as we mentioned earlier, there's the climate change that's threatening all this delicate ecosystem, the hydrological model that's at work underneath of all these layers. Well, there is also, Shane mentioned, neatly explained that there's been historically, it's been very important for the local communities in terms of extraction for fuel. Sorry, I'm messing up with my notes. So yeah, so any solution we come up with in terms of restoration will have to have the local buy-in for these reasons. So that's why the Flow Country Partnership is very important, as it brings together agencies and NGOs and people that will have at heart the interest of people living in the Flow Country, and not only the natural environment and the biodiversity up there. All that in line with the Scottish Government's Just Transition principles. So the problem here is that we're looking at something that's of a great scale. It's also an opportunity, but one of the problem is that we will not be only looking at engaging with the larger landowners and the large estates. We will have to aggregate also smaller more granular piece of lands. If, for example, there's a lot of crofting lands over there, and all that has to come together one way or another, because restoration will only be really meaningful if it's done at scale. There is also reason from a financial perspective to be working at scale. Investment, when we're talking about larger scale investors, will be not looking at something that's of smaller size for cost reasons and also efficiency reasons. But it's also implies a lot of difficulties in terms of building up this kind of aggregation vehicle. But there are ways to do it, and we're working on this. And with the carbon markets that we've been mentioning, there is at least one kind of revenue stream that we can secure through the restoration of these areas to try to fund and maintain the areas in proper conditions. I think we can go to the next slide, please. So the Flow Country Partnership will be trying to support all the different projects that will be arising locally in terms of restoring the peat. First, we will try to work with the different landowners, as we talked, smaller, bigger, and try to identify with them sites of greatest importance, bearing in mind the connectivity and all the hydrological connectivity that's happening underneath all these layers. The aggregation vehicle will then be able to support the project in terms of designing the restoration, what would work best, bringing its experience, and also its financing capacities to help fund the restoration that will happen on site. This is kind of in advance of future returns that will come through the selling of carbon credits that Rupal mentioned a little bit earlier. Some of the return will be shared, of course, with the landowner, some with the SQIO that will be created to represent the partnership and all the people involved in these restorations. It's important also to note that this is done in parallel to a bid for an appellation of the UNESCO, so the UNESCO World Heritage Site, and that's important because that will bring to the table more than just carbon credits. These carbon credits will have additional benefits in terms of the value of the underlying natural asset that's been restored. In terms of ecological, of course, integrity, but also in terms of economical benefit for the local communities, and also in terms of the potential in terms of charisma, ecotourism, and so on. So it's all neatly packaged together, so to try to bring the most value to the carbon credits that are being sold. So that's kind of a bundling approach, as we call it, trying to bundle all these benefits together to achieve a higher selling price for the benefit of landowners and people involved in the restoration. Next slide, please.
Just 1 minute, Patrick, that'd be great. Then we make sure we have time for the quick questions.
Yes, I don't think I would expand too much then on this slide. It's just representing a little bit the flows of funding and the interaction, but you have the SQIO that will be quite central, that will be providing with the supporting the restoration on the identified sites in partnership with the landowners, and will be receiving then part of the returns as well as the landowners and investors that will be able to come in. That's the important bit for investors at the SQIO. There will be SPVs that will be created, also special purpose vehicles underneath the SQIO that will be actually doing the investment under the governance of the SQIO in a transparent and high integrity way. So we can expand more in detail if people require during the Q&A. So let's skip to that. Thank you very much.
Perfect. Thank you very much. I think we've got just over 10 minutes and lots of questions coming into the chat and really clear who they're being directed to.